Hey guys, Metal Jesus here. Obviously, I'm known for my love of video games and also metal music. However, many of you may not know that I also like non-metal albums like Daft Punk here. So for this video, I thought it might be kind of fun for me to cover some of my favorite non-metal albums. Let's take a look. All right, I'm gonna start with something that might surprise a lot of people. Maybe some of you haven't even heard of this. This is Jean-Michel Jarre, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and his 1976 classic electronic album called Oxygene. Some people call this chill out music. It's definitely instrumental electronic music from the 70s. I like it because it's just an absolute time capsule as to what it was really like to make that kind of music back then, and it's super listenable. I mean, not all electronic music stands the test of time, but I really think that Oxygene definitely does. Now, occasionally I do get into a jazzy mood, and I particularly like the 1950s, 60s bebop instrumental jazz, and one of my all-time favorites is Dave Brubeck, and this is a live album here at Carnegie Hall, like it mentions, that is unreal. It's so energetic. It's so amazingly played. It's awe-inspiring. And again, I'm not a big jazz guy. I'm not going to try to convince you that I know everything about jazz. But when I put this album on, I'm blown away every single time. Here's an album that I discovered while working at a small record store in the early 90s, and it's My Bloody Valentine, and it's the album called Loveless. At the time, this album was the most expensive indie produced album ever made. And when you listen to it, you may hear that and you may not, because it's technically called shoegazer music. And the idea behind that is that the guitars are not riffy. They're not palm muted. They're not like traditional rock music. Instead, they're soundscapes. They're noisy. They're layered. They're thick. And this is the kind of album that when you first put it on, you're probably not going to get it. I certainly didn't, but there's something really compelling to it. And as you listen to it, you start picking up on the little subtleties of the melody. It's a stunning album. I think it's one of the greatest albums ever made, and I still put it on even to this day. I have a confession to make, and that is when it comes to the band Queen, for the most part, for most of my life, I really only followed their hits. And their hits are excellent, but I never really spent the time digging into their full albums until I took the time and listened to A Night at the Opera. And what I discovered is, and this is probably to, some of you, like, no surprise here, but for me, it was a huge surprise to learn that even their deep album cuts are absolutely amazing. The level of musicianship and the skill at songwriting is no better shown than in this album right here. Yes, you're gonna hear all the hits, but it's all the stuff around those hits that I think just makes this an absolutely classic album. I remember a friend of mine telling me back in 2001, 2002 to check out this band called Daft Punk and the album Discovery. And I did. And I think I actually went out and just bought it, but I did not get it at all. I was completely confused by this. To be quite honest, I actually didn't even like it. I mean, it wasn't that I just didn't have any feelings for it. I actually didn't like it. It was only until I saw the movie, the animated movie that they created for this, where I suddenly got the brilliance of this album. This has to be one of my all-time favorite albums, bar none, regardless of genre. Once I got it, once I was able to figure out all the nuances of this album, I think it's an absolute masterpiece. I love it from beginning to end. Another band that I absolutely did not get back when I was in high school and college is Steely Dan. I had a roommate that listened to a lot of Steely Dan, and I hated it. I didn't get it. It felt like soft rock to me. And now, later, again, when you put on a good pair of headphones and you really sit down and listen to a Steely Dan album, suddenly the brilliance of their mashup of jazz and California rock suddenly becomes very apparent, and you just get it. I'm kind of cheating here because I couldn't choose between Pretzel Logic and Asia. But if I had to choose, it probably would be Asia. I know that's kind of it's a cliche because that is considered their masterpiece, but for good reason. It's a flawless album from beginning to end. I've been a Weezer fan since the very first Blue album that they released way back in the day with Buddy Holly and all that stuff. But for some reason, it's Maladroit is the album that actually I think is probably my all-time favorite. And it's hard for me to put a finger on it because I do think that Weezer writes really good songs and good solid albums. But for some reason, this album here just is a nice mix of kind of light pop and darker rock elements to it. There's some great guitar solos in this as well. And I think for me, I have a soft spot for this album because it came out at a time when I was road tripping from Seattle down to California. And I remember we just listened to it in the car the whole way there. So there's a lot of good memories associated with it. Here's another jazz album that probably shows up on a lot of people's list, and for very good reason. This is Miles Davis, Kinda Blue. And again, it's probably cliche to say at this point. For some people, it's like, really? You picked one of the best-selling albums of all time? Well, yes, because sometimes things are justified for their popularity, and this is one of those. This is an album where if you have a great stereo system and you want to really show it off, you put this album on and people stop talking. It's an amazing jazz album. There's nothing bad about it. It's fantastic all these years later. It's a classic. And speaking of a classic, I remember the day that I first heard Purple Rain by Prince and the Revolution. And I know a lot of kids like me in the 80s. We remember this was a huge album, and for very good reason. It's so varied. It's rock, it's R&B. There's a little bit of weirdness and craziness going on here. It's an insane album. I mean, it's so creative, and it was Prince at his absolute pinnacle. And I think that's the reason why it still holds up today. It's just a great album. There's not a bad track on it. Here's an album that I bet some of you haven't heard of before. This is a band called His Name Is Alive, and this is their very first release, I believe back in 1990, called Livonia. And this is considered to be dream pop. And I think that's a simplistic description of this because this is pretty complex, dense, yet beautiful and haunting music. And for a while there, when I was working in a record store, I devoured their first 3 albums. They're so interesting. There's nothing quite like the band His Name Is Alive, and for that they stand the test of time for me. Another album from my childhood came out around the time also of the Madonnas and the Princes and stuff like that. But man, Billy Idol, Rebel Yell blew my little mind when I was growing up. Here is this guy who was part punk rock, but then you had Steve Stevens in there and shredding. I mean, this was everything that I wanted. It was so rebellious. And I lived in a really small town at the time. There was only 3,000 people there. And so for this, for me, for this album here, it was like a world away. I could not get enough of this album. And of course, it's got a lot of great hits on it, but also, again, I like the B-sides as well. Just a great, great album. Of course, I have to talk about Pink Floyd. Man, Pink Floyd. I went through a period where I listened to so much Pink Floyd. I mean, I didn't need to take drugs. I was getting it off of the albums just by playing it, you know? And so I'm going to cheat here because I have a hard time choosing between The Wall, which I think is an absolute masterpiece, and was really a big part of my life, especially in high school. But the album that I go back to time and time again when I'm in the mood for Pink Floyd is 1977's Animals. This is the album they released right before The Wall, and it's a very dark, very bleak album, but it's so dense, so rich, so interesting. It's all about people as animals and how messed up society is and politics and all this stuff. It's just a really deep, cool album. It's my absolute favorite. Now you notice that there's not a lot of new wave pop on here, and that's because in general I would, listen to Casey Kasem's top 40 countdown or whatever it was, and yeah, I'd listen to the singles, but I didn't really get into a lot of the bands except for the Cars. Heartbeat City is a new wave album of the time that I really, really dug. It's a good mix of guitar playing and a real garage band sound, but also a lot of keyboards. And I just feel like the songwriting was really solid on this one. Again, even the B-sides I like quite a bit. This was an album that I devoured for years and years, and I can still go back to it today and really enjoy it. Obviously, those are some of the non-heavy rock or metal albums in my collection that I still listen to even to this day, but of course I could have gone on for much longer because, well, I'm a huge music fan, and also as a musician, I try to draw both from, what I normally play, which is punk and metal, but I like to draw from other genres too. There's lessons to be learned in all of this stuff. And I think there's, if you're a real music fan, you definitely branch out to other genres. And I would love to know down in the comments what music you think I should check out. Again, don't worry about the genre. If you think it's good, I want to know about it. Let me know down in the comments. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.